Hi everyone, it's Jerry. In December of 2010, the Women's World Chess Championship took place, with 16-year-old child prodigy and Grandmaster Hou Yifan of China winning the title. This makes her the youngest ever female to become world champion, and on her road to that world champion title, she had to play against some really strong players, one of whom was Grandmaster Chen in round 3. Let's have a look at one of their games. So we have Yifan with the white pieces playing E4, Chen opting for the French defense, E6, D4 and D5. One quote that I recently came across by Grandmaster Larry Evans reads, "The hallmark of the artist is simplicity." And I think that that quote really acts as a very good description of this particular game, because we don't see any sacrifices or tactics coming about. There's no fireworks that show up in this game, but that's not to say that those sorts of things aren't having to be considered during the course of the game. This game really takes a very positional approach, and a lot of the moves are played with a great deal of logic to them. So let's have a look. Knight C3, Knight F6. I'll just show a couple variations which are possible out of the French defense, which I believe are very worthwhile to know, because they end up with a position where we have a different pawn structure. So we could see bishop to b4 going into the Winnoir variation with the following sequence of moves showing themselves, where we have the exchange on c3 and ultimately white with doubled c-pawns, but as compensation has the bishop pair as well as a space advantage indicated by the pawn on e5. So is this a liability? Is this an asset? That's the sort of struggle that goes on in this sort of situation, is sort of pawn structure. We don't enter that territory. Instead, knight f6 is played, followed by bishop g5. One other possibility is e5, just closing the center up, chasing the knight back to d7, and we have the following situation coming about, where we have pawn to f4. What is white looking to do? Simply build a pawn center. What does black do? Tries to take it down, challenging this pawn on d4. A lot of the attention is centered around this d4 pawn. A lot of pieces are hitting it. A lot of the white pieces are defending it. So we don't enter this position either, but just showing you a couple of the different pawn structures which could come about from the French defense. Instead of e5, we see the move played in the game, bishop g5, followed by the exchange on e4. Knight takes, and now knight on b to d7. So as a result of the exchange on e4, we have a half open center. So development is going to be fairly easy for both sides. Both sides are really just looking to develop their pieces to what they feel are going to be the optimal squares for them. There's a little bit of pressure against f6, but that's not something that's really too much of an inconvenience on the black side. So knight f3, h6 challenges the piece that's maybe being the most annoying to the black side, the bishop. Exchange on f6, followed by bishop to e3. Now at this point in the game, instinctually, what I would be doing is playing my bishop back to h4, and the reason I would do that is because you try to be really annoying to your opponent as best you can. Why alleviate the pin right away? Maybe have black work a little bit more, play to e7, or maybe chase the bishop away. That's something I wouldn't be recommending at all. But at least maintain the pin, in other words. And so when I saw the move played was bishop e3, I thought to myself, well, why wasn't the move bishop h4 played? I had to do some thinking on my own. I was thinking, well, what are the differences? What are the differences between coming to e3 opposed to h4? And here's one of the reasons. You come to e3 to take into account one of the plans that black likes to implement. What is that plan exactly, or what is the one move that black likes to try to implement from this opening, or at least this position right here, is c5. They like to maybe get this pawn to c5 to challenge white's d4 pawn. So by playing the bishop to e3, you make that sort of move that much more difficult to get in, because the bishop is indirectly controlling that c5 square. Whereas from h4, it most certainly is not controlling that c5 square. So that's just at least one difference between h4 and e3. So bishop to e3, bishop d6. Where do you go? e7 or d6? It's better placed on d6. There's no pin to try and, it's not like this knight is pinned. You don't want to You want to go to a more aggressive square, in other words. d6 will do two things. One, it keeps an eye on h2 in the event white castles kingside, but not only that, it's watching over e5 in case this knight wants to hop to a more central square. Bishop d3, similarly, you don't want to go to e2. It's not like the bishop is going to come out here and be annoying to your knight. Let's get it on a more aggressive square. This h6 move was played, a pawn, when you move it from a light square, you're weakening your light squares, so this bishop is now functioning quite well along this diagonal. Black castles, queen d2. It may seem very tempting to want to just do a routine move like castle right away. And while that might be a good move, why not maybe make a more flexible move like queen d2? Maybe you have thoughts of castling queenside, or at the very least, you're making your opponent think about you potentially going queenside. Where's the address going to be for the white king? Kingside, queenside, you're at least keeping black guessing for one additional move. Also, what you're doing by playing to d2 is having thoughts of maybe some sacrifices on h6. Maybe black will have to deal with the queen potentially ending up on h6 after bishop takes h6. So we have that sort of thing kind of being taken into account right now with this knight d5 move. In the event that the pawn is taken now, the best that white can do is a perpetual check. There's a mate threat with queen h7 that's prevented with just f5. Blunts this bishop's diagonal, and now the queen is really just going to have to give perpetual check. That's really the best that white can do from that position. If you try to do anything more with getting another piece involved with knight g5, queen e7 is there in time guarding all of the 7th rank squares. So there's not going to be any more attack. It's just going to be the queen and knight, but there's adequate defense. So, in other words, we don't take on this square with the white pieces because really we're looking to win the game, not just give a perpetual and draw the game. So instead, queenside castle comes about, followed by b6, very logical. Let's get this bishop on b7, the long light square diagonal. And at this point, we have king b1. You'll note at this point, grabbing on h6 is actually losing because of a deadly fork on f2. Queen, king, fork, lights out for white. So, king b1. This is another thing to keep in mind. If you're going to castle queenside, one of the follow-up moves that you're likely going to be having to make is your king scooting one square closer to the corner square, where from b1, what is it now doing? One, it's guarding that a2 pawn, which was unprotected, and two, it's getting itself off of an open diagonal. So queen e7, this is another instance where just out of routine or out of instinct, I would be playing bishop b7. You played b6 for a reason. Why not just play bishop b7 right away to follow up? So what are the differences, in other words? This is another instance. After king b1, what are the differences between playing bishop b7 opposed to queen e7? Well, I think queen e7 was played in order to really just not even allow this sort of sacrifice, since the queen is already on the e7 square. After f5, not only is that preventing mate on h7, it's also preventing a perpetual check at this point because the queen can interpose on g7. So that's maybe one of the reasons why we're seeing just this queen e7 move first opposed to bishop b7. Rook on h to e1, very logical. Half open file here. Let's throw a rook on it. Bishop b7, completing the development. We're clearly in the middle game here. We got all our pieces out. What do we do next? We try to improve upon our pieces' positioning. So is there a better square for this knight to be on? Yes, knight e5, more central square. And unfortunately, it's a square that this knight really can't be chased away from. f6, not to be recommended. Knight g6, deadly fork, game over. Even if this square wasn't accessible to the knight, let's just say this pawn hypothetically was still on h6. Would you really be wanting to chase the knight away with f6? Probably not, because then e6 would become a target. It's already indirectly, there's already indirect pressure on it by the rook, and someday you may be very well seeing the bishop come to c4 to add even more pressure to it. So really what it's coming down to is that the knight on e5 is intolerable and is best dealt with by just taking it out and not chasing it away. So bishop takes knight, pawn takes bishop, followed by knight takes bishop. Black is likely just wanting to get away of getting out of any possibility for maybe some sacrifice. And now since this h-rook is already on e1, you may very well see some sacrifice coming on h6 and then the rook swinging up and over. And what we would then have is the queen, rook, and the bishop on d3 trying to coordinate themselves against some attack against the black king. So I think black really just avoids any of that sort of nonsense and just gets rid of the e3 bishop, the dark square bishop. And after queen takes knight, we have rook on f to d1. Black does best not to grab on g2. Notice we're castled on opposite sides. We don't want to be opening up an avenue or a file for our opponent's rooks. That's exactly what grabbing that pawn would do. We would see this sort of situation going on where black is in some rough shape. So that's why we're not seeing bishop takes pawn. Instead, rook on f, rook on f to d1. I guess one other slight, I'm just seeing this right now. Initially when I reviewed it, I didn't see it, but just as I'm going through it right now, I'm trying to see what are the differences maybe between, this rook moving opposed to this one. There probably isn't too much difference, but I'm thinking by moving the f rook, you're at least giving your king one additional square it could maybe run to, if it needs to run. I don't know. Those are just some rough thoughts I'm just coming up with right now. So rook on f to d1, f4. One thing that you want to, it's not always the case that you need to be thinking long term in chess, but there are instances where you try to anticipate as best you can. You try to forecast the exchange of certain pieces and how maybe you should be positioning your pawns or maybe even your king in the resulting sort of positions. What am I talking about exactly? Well, let's take into account this position here where we have exactly one open file, namely the D file. When we have an instance like that where there's just one open file, completely open, there's no pawns at all, it's likely going to be the case that both sets of rooks are going to be exchanged, and maybe even the queens. In this game, we have exactly that going on. We have both sets of rooks and the queens coming off the board. And so in anticipation of the more simplified endgame, where it's just the bishops, king, and pawn, what do we want to do exactly? Well, since we have bishops, and both of them are on light squares, what both sides are going to look to do is place their pawns on dark squares. Now, why do we want to do this? We want to do this for a couple of reasons. One, by placing our pawns on dark squares, we are, well, what are we doing exactly? By placing your pawns on dark squares, we are removing any potential target for our opponent's bishop, and also we're staying out of the way of our own bishop. By having pawns on dark squares, our bishop isn't going to be obstructed by having the pawns on dark squares. So those are a couple things to keep in mind at this point. Assuming that both rooks and queens are off the board, white is also going to be better for one additional reason. Not only do they have the better pawns on the board, when you just compare these two right here, we could say that in that sort of ending, white would be a little better. White would also be a little bit better because their king is going to have an easier time becoming more central. This pawn on e5 is guarding d6 and f6, and it's kind of creating a little wall, and it's kind of difficult for this black king to maybe try and sneak around. And you'll notice that if it is to sneak around like that, it's going to have to do so by traveling on light squares, and typically you're not going to want to be keeping your king on the same color square as the remaining bishop that's on the board. So these are just some long-term ideas to keep in mind from this point. So how do things progress? We have doubling of rooks, rook d7 followed by rook to d2. It's also worth noting, again, you still don't want to take this pawn right now, not for this reason, not for the reason that the queen can't immediately take the pawn back, but there's still pressure with the move like queen h3. Now the threat of just taking on h6 is still a problem for black. How do you meet that threat? Do you try to run away? f5 is coming about, and now there's possibilities for f6 to really smash open the black king side. More files are opening up. It's not worth it. Don't do it. So instead, what we do see, f4, the doubling of rooks, followed by king f8. In anticipation of the exchange of rooks, the king wants to be a bit more central. g3, getting a pawn on a dark square, and queen c5. This is a curious move, offering a queen exchange. I'm not so sure that's needed right away. Maybe just a waiting move like bishop c6, preventing maybe the bishop from coming to b5. Maybe you could do bishop c6 like this and maybe even scoot the king over a little bit more. That would probably be, you know, unnecessary, but why not maybe just play bishop c6, at least wait a move, see what white is going to do, and maybe only then play queen c5. I'm not sure what the rush would be with playing queen c5 right away, but nevertheless, that's what we do have. The exchange of queens comes about, so there's a drawback with the result of that. Is there a way, well, the drawback is the doubled c-pawns, but is there a way to really take advantage of it? That has yet to be seen, so let's see. King c1, this bishop is now free to move. Prior to king to c1, the rook didn't have enough protection. Bishop f3, and now bishop to e2. So since there's tension between these rooks, there's no time for any bishop captures at this point right here. And instead we have the exchange of rooks, and white conveniently recaptures and brings the king more central. King is now on d2, and we're noticing that black is choosing not to exchange bishops, and rightly so, because if we do have the exchange of bishops, this is going to be a one endgame for white. Let's just take a quick peek and see why that would be the case. We have a race here where white is going to put pressure on the pawn. After king c6, this is a strong move. a4. What is this pawn looking to do? It's looking to get to a5. What's the big deal with the pawn getting to a5? Let's see what happens if it's allowed to get there. g6, a5. What is it doing now? It's guarding b6. The pawn is guarding. The pawn on e5 is guarding d6. All of these squares guarded by the king. If this king is now in a position where if it has to move, its only choices are to retreat to b7 or d7, both of which would allow the white king to grab on the c5 square. And if that pawn is taken, that's just going to be a much easier endgame to even play than this one right here. So we don't want to get into a position, in other words, where this black king isn't going to have a square to move back and forth on, because if you do get into this situation, what's going to end up happening is black is going to be the side that's going to have to retreat their king first, because white has many expendable moves. They have tempo moves like c3, b3, and h4. Let's just run through one quick one. If we saw these sorts of pawn advances, you could have b3, h5, h4. This king already has to retreat, and even if, you know, black had one additional move, white has another additional move. So white even has a move to spare, so to speak. So the king is going to have to retreat. This pawn is going to be gobbled up, and soon enough we're going to have the king threatening to either sneak around to grab the f7 pawn, or maybe eating the a6 or c7 pawn. So that would be one way to win. The other way to win at this point is to meet after a4. Maybe the best way to put up resistance is with a5, but as a direct result of that move, now what we could do as white is create an outside pass pawn starting first with c3. Let's just say king b6, b4. We have this sort of exchange going on. An outside pass pawn is going to win in this situation. This pawn is much more valuable than this pawn. While black is taking time to grab this pawn that's on the edge of the board, you'll notice that the white king grabs the c pawn and stays more centrally located, and as a result is going to be that much quicker to gobbling up the queenside pawns, or excuse me, the kingside pawns. So in other words, the resulting endgame position here after the exchange of bishops would be a win for white. So bishop d5 instead, avoiding the exchange. King c3, king to e7, more central king. You don't want to grab this pawn because you're going to lose very quickly. You get trapped. King b2 and the bishop's cooked. Instead, king e7, bishop c4, offering an exchange, knowing full well that it's going to prove to be a win for white if that comes about. So black avoids that exchange. Bishop comes back to b3. The king is trying to get to c4 and then grab on c5. Bishop stops that. Notice how the pawn on this dark square is coordinated quite well with the light square bishop, forming like a little wall stopping the white king from advancing. Bishop c4, so we have a little bit of a repetition of moves. King b3, king d7, and now after bishop to d3, the king is looking to once again get here and then to c5, and also it's also threatening to get to a4. So the bishop stops the king from getting to c4, but the king runs in this direction. It's going after maybe this isolated pawn. So this is a nice little journey that the king is taking here. It's kind of sneaking around on the queen side, where the side of the board, in other words, where black has weaknesses, where black is a bit vulnerable. So king to c6, similarly, you don't want to grab this pawn for the same reason, b3, and then the bishop is a goner. So c4, this seems counterintuitive. I was just saying not too long ago, you don't want to be placing your pawns on light squares, so why is this move being played now? Well, the good reason that white is assigning for that is by having this pawn fixed on this c4 square, you're really restraining any of these black pawns from any movement whatsoever, and it comes with tempo. There's a threat against the bishop. So bishop f3, king a5. How do you prevent the king from getting to a6? If it gets to a6, this pawn is going to be lost. So, and if you try to defend this pawn, now the c5 pawn is going to be lost. You can't do two things. So unfortunately, I guess black at this point is saying, well, I'd rather hang on to this pawn. He's more important for me to hang on to, because if white gets this pawn, this is going to be immediately a passed pawn. So let's let him get the c5 pawn instead. It doesn't really matter at this point. The c5 pawn falls. These don't help out the black position at all. In fact, they just turn out to be more targets for the light square bishop. One day it would like to maybe get to this e8 square and go into Pac-Man mode, gobbling up all these pawns. And that's exactly what's threatened right now. Bishop c2 gets ready to come to a4. Black, unfortunately, can only prevent the bishop from making headway towards this f7 pawn for so long. b4, a6, and after a3 we actually have black resigning. Is this a premature resignation at this point? Well, no, it's not, because what is there to do? Black is in zugzwang, or in other words, regardless of whatever move that black plays here, the end result is going to be the worsening of their position. For example, if the bishop goes to e8, we could see bishop check, and if the king goes here, we have bishop c6. The exchange of bishops is forced, and if the pawn blocks, now notice that d6 is no longer guarded. We're going to have the king slip in towards the king side, and these pawns are going to be gobbled up soon. What would an alternative variation be? Well, what about bishop here? Well, bishop to a4, and now again there's no way to really stop the bishop from getting into that e8 square. Once again, if you play c6, the king sneaks in. That would be game over. So as it was in this game, after pawn to a3, just this little innocent type of move, just moving a single square, we end up having black resigning. So that's all for this video. As always, I hope you got something out of it. Take care. Bye.